I think human beings adapt to almost anything. That's one of the things that's really beautiful about us. And one of the heartbreaking things too. Because when somebody grows up around fear, unpredictability, emotional instability, violence, neglect, shame, trauma, the nervous system learns to survive those environments. You become observant. You monitor people's moods. You anticipate danger. You learn how to stay small, stay quiet, stay useful, stay safe. And those responses make sense while danger is happening. The problem is the body often keeps responding long after danger is over. I think many people don't realize how deeply survival rewires behavior. You may call yourself distant, awkward, cold, anxious, hypersexual, controlling, emotionally unavailable, overly independent, without realizing those behaviors may have once protected you, but not because you were born broken, but because your nervous system adapted intelligently to difficult circumstances. One thing I've noticed is that many people in free stop questioning their survival patterns, because eventually they start saying, "This is just who I am. I'm just bad at relationships. I'm just anxious. I'm emotionally detached. I'm just avoidant. I'm just bad with people." But sometimes what feels like personality is actually protection. And that realization can be emotional, because suddenly you start wondering, who would I have been if survival hadn't shaped so much of me? That's a painful question, especially for people who are experienced trauma young, because when survival begins in childhood, you may never fully meet the version of yourself untouched by fear. I think grief exists in that realization too. Grief for the self that never fully got to develop safely. I also think people underestimate how exhausting long-term hypervigilance is. Always scanning, always anticipating, always emotionally bracing. That level of survival drains the body, and eventually exhaustion begins showing up everywhere. Motivation, relationships, work, intimacy, friendships, creativity, self-worth. You begin surviving life instead of participating in it. And honestly, that can become incredibly lonely, because people often praise survival adaptations externally. They'll say, "You're so strong, you're independent, you handle everything yourself," without realizing that sometimes independence is actually fear. Sometimes strength is exhaustion wearing armor. And if you've spent years surviving, and if you've become emotionally guarded, if you've struggled trusting people, if you feel disconnected from your emotions, your body, your identity, if survival has shaped the way you move through the world, I want you to hear me clearly. Your survival responses are not proof that you are broken. They are proof that your nervous system adapted the best way it knew how. And adaptation is not failure. If you had to become hyper-aware to survive, if you learned to stay small, if vulnerability became dangerous, if loneliness became familiar, I want you to hear me clearly. The person you built around survival still deserves compassion, not shame. I think healing is partly the process of teaching the nervous system you don't have to survive anything anymore. And honestly, that can feel terrifying at first, because survival patterns become familiar. Even exhausting patterns can feel safer than change. Sometimes people remain emotionally frozen because freeze became predictable. And predictability can feel safer than being vulnerable. That's important to understand. Healing is not just how to move forward. Sometimes healing is learned how to tolerate safety. Learning to rest, learning to trust, learning how to exist without constantly preparing for impact. And that process takes time. I also think identity rebuilds slowly. Tiny movements. Trying something new. Resting without guilt. Being emotionally honest with one person. Allowing yourself joy without immediately expecting disaster afterwards. Tiny movements. Because survival mode teaches people the world is dangerous, healing slowly teaches not every moment requires protection. And honestly, that's a difficult lesson for many survivors and nervous systems to believe immediately. I don't think healing means becoming someone entirely different. I think healing means slowly reconnecting to the parts of yourself that survival buried. The soft parts, the creative parts, the trusting parts, the peaceful parts. And maybe part of the journey is realizing you are more than survival strategies than that once protected you. Even if those strategies carried you for years. This has been Out of Freeze. The opposite of freeze is flow. Tiny movements, big change. I'll see you next time, friends. Thanks for listening.